Thanks, Mark, and good evening, everyone. Lovely to be with you again and to continue our study of Romans. And I'm going to do a little bit of a recap, just so that we are all on the same page from last week. Can't remember if everyone was at our class last week. So as you would remember, the screen shows a clock face, or the workings of a clock, and my point was that the Romans, the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans, is a very technical argument, and we could get very technical. We could sort of get very fascinated about how each cog within the argument turns another cog, and how it all sort of works together intricately, pulling all of the arguments from the Old Testament together. But we're going to lift ourselves above all of that and say, well, what's the whole point of the clockwork, as it were? And that is to tell the time. And in this case, we really want to look at what's Paul really trying to get at. And I do want this to be interactive. So I really would be encouraging you to sort of jump in with examples as we get to those points. And hopefully you'll recall some of the theory that we went through last week in terms of the chapters from I guess chapter 2 through to 11. And what I'm going to do is really just pick up the pieces from there and just pick up the story at the summary that we really thought the apostle put into this, and we'll go from there. So, if you recall, Paul says it's not good enough. It's not good enough for us to just want to be saved and say, well, yeah, I'd like to be part of it, but it doesn't really. I don't really want to change my life. And he's saying that's not it. If you're really serious about this, then you do need to let this affect you, and for you be willing to allow it to shape your life. So I'm going to. I'm just trying to make sure I can see everyone in case anyone wants to jump in. All right, and so he says we need to be sincere, and to do that we need to submit and acknowledge that it's not all about us. It's actually about our other brothers and sisters, and it needs to impact our hearts and our behaviours. And of course, and we talked about this trap where as soon as we think we've got it all sorted out, we start making it hard for others and putting burdens on others. And that's where the apostle really does pick up the argument that we're going to talk about tonight, and not making it harder for others. So that was his first summary. So he's really just saying, we need to be really careful how we apply this. So he then also, though, doesn't just give us warnings. He also gives us the good news that it is available for everybody. And everyone he's saying, God wants everyone to be saved if possible. And so therefore, we have a response, the appropriate response that we should feel, and that is, here I am, send me, as some of those faithful in the Bible are recorded as saying. And we recall the point that faith is the qualifier for all this. It's actually the enabler for it all, and the complete opposite of having the right attitude, guiding our faith, and having humility is pride, because that's putting ourselves forward and ourselves up rather than acknowledging our true position before God. And so the path that we all follow, if we're going to get it right, is that we start in ignorance or unbelief. We move through realization of our true position before God, and then that, of course, should make us humble. And in that position, once we have arrived at a place of humility, then we are in a position to be able to accept God's mercy. And my point last week, if you recall, when I got to this point, I said, see, it's not that hard after all. You know, it's not that technical. That is, in fact, the summary of Paul's theory argument. And he then goes on to sort of complete the argument. And it would be useful for you tonight to have your Bibles, if you have, there at Romans. And at the end of chapter 11, he gives this exclamation in verses 33 to 36. If you've got a New International Version, it calls it a doxology, but it's really, which is really just a summary of the way in which he concludes and exclaims that that we've got this wonderful position that we can be right with God, and that, of course, is very much to do with at the time of judgment. But no one has an advantage. No one's got a head start over us in this. And the good news is that God has provided a gift, and that gift, as we all know, is his Son, to enable it all to occur and enable us to get there. And if we accept and understand all of that, then we will respond in the way that we live. And that's really leading us straight into where we are tonight. This is about the response, and hopefully, been able to get across to you the theory from chapters 2 to 11, and we're going to now go through chapters 12 to 15. So again, I say that these all fit together as if you like, cogs in this intricate argument that Paul has put together for us. So we're going to now dive into the practice in chapters 12 to 15. So we sort of lead straight into chapter 12. In chapter 12, if you want to put a title on it, a heading on it all, it would be called Living Sacrifices. And Paul says, and we're going to do a little bit, follow a little bit more verse by verse here, but not, we're not going to really sort of go picking out individual verses particularly, but just to show you that where we're up to in this. So Paul sort of picks up from verses 1 to 3. He says, the rational outcome of this whole argument, if you've heard and understood what I'm saying, Paul says, then we need to be living sacrifices. And he's saying that as opposed to dead, unreasoning animals. The sacrifices that were given under the law, I mean, they can't think, they can't do anything, they can't reason, they're just dead sacrifices. Whereas Paul's saying we need to be living sacrifices and thinking about what we're doing and being rational about it. And so all of the parts of the body, as we know, and we talked about remember the body of Christ is the thing that we have now joined to, and all parts depend on each other and all have different capacities. And that's the argument between verses 6 to 8. And the only limiting factor in all of that is our lack of faith. So if we lack faith, then we are going to be held back in progressing. And so we ought to be trying to outdo each other, he says in verse 10, seeking the best for others in the Ecclesia rather than ourselves, and valuing what others say. And I guess, to make the point, we don't need to push our point, because all that pushing our particular point of view is doing is making us feel like that our thoughts and our way is more important than someone else's. And so that Paul's saying, we don't need to do that. We don't need to push our point with each other. But he does say in verse 11 that we need to do it with enthusiasm, that we need to feel the value of the others that we're interacting with. And that's all about sharing. It's about trying to achieve and looking, valuing the whole business of harmony. And that, and he picks this up in 1 Corinthians as well in his discussion with the Corinthian Ecclesia in chapter 12, verse 25. He says, when one suffers, all suffer with it. It's this whole argument about the fact that we're interconnected. We're all part of this together. And so if one's feeling bad, we've talked about Brandon tonight, sort of feeling bad, and we all feel bad for him because he's suffering at the moment. And Paul's saying, like, he knows that our weaknesses, we all have weaknesses, we all have problems, and he knows that that's going to cause friction. And so he really puts this value on us having harmony and striving to work together. And he knows, and that's why he's putting this emphasis on it, he knows that's harder than we might think, because we all have our differences. And so, yes, sharing in the suffering is one thing, but also we need to be able to share the happy times and the good times as well. And that can sometimes be an even harder point. I mean, it's one thing to be feeling really sorry for someone that's suffering, but do we feel happiness for those that are in a happy position and sharing their joy, or do we feel envious about that? Because we can sometimes feel like, well, it's not needed. They're going okay, so they don't need me to be celebrating with them. But Paul's point is we really need to enjoy and share and encourage in the good times, as well as feeling support for times when it's not so well. And so all of this is to build ourselves and our ecclesial family. And back to his point, if you remember from our theory discussion last week, it's about a marriage to the ecclesia. That is, from chapter 7, he's saying, you have been married to another, that is to Christ, and in specifically, he's saying to the body of Christ, which is the ecclesia. And so he says, verse 16, I'm at now, he's saying, you need then allow yourself to be challenged. Allow yourself to think that you may not have it quite right. And that's sometimes tough. We might have put a lot of effort into thinking about a point or a view or something that's very important to us. And we need to allow ourselves that, we may not have it exactly right. And so, and this is the sort of the wrap up of the chapter, he has this sort of run of arguments. So he says, don't retaliate in verse 17. He says, don't add fuel to a fire in verse 18. He says, leave it to God, because then that's verse 19. And then the reason he says is that God can punish far better than we can in verse 20. And so fill your life with good in order to keep the bad out in verse 21. And that's how he wraps up the chapter. Okay, so that's the argument of chapter 12. Hopefully you've all sort of followed that and now ready to engage. So what we're going to do is have a think about that. So what does that mean? Because as you understand, this class is about life applications. Okay, so question: who would you like to join you in the future for the universe? Because that's sort of really what this is about. This, might sound a bit over the top, but in actual fact, when you reflect on this, that's the reality of what we're talking about. But if we're going to be part of God's long-term plan and purpose, then we're actually in the process of preparing for the much longer-term future of the universe, and so we ought to be thinking about, well, who would I like to be with in that time? And it's of course then the challenge of, well, if depending on who that might be. And you might be thinking, well, surely not some of the people in this meeting, they're far too irritating, or hopefully you're not thinking that. We're actually, hopefully thinking that everyone in this meeting are the people that we'd like to be with at that time. And so Paul's challenging us and saying, well, what do you need to do to help them get ready? And finally, in terms of reflecting, Paul's asking us, well, what's your best contribution to the Ecclesia? Because we all do things differently. We all have different contributions and different value to contribute. But what is your best contribution? And in particular, what would help you do it more? Because Paul's asking us to think about that, to think about how we can support and help the Ecclesia even more. So I'll just pause and check in whether anyone would like to jump into that conversation.
It's interesting that you, one of the things that chapter, Romans 12, says is to do things enthusiastically. So my first thought was, who would you like to join you in the future? Like people who really wanted to be there. And I knew they were that was everything they wanted. Like that would be my answer to the first part. Someone who was enthusiastic for that future.
Yep, great answer, Jordan. It's I think that's the what we're looking for in each other is that sense of really wanting to be there, and then that enthusiasm, back to Paul's point, is infectious. All right, hopefully that's got your sort of brains into gear now. We're going to press on because there's more challenges to come. All right, so that's chapter 12. Let's get stuck in now into chapter 13. Okay, so now chapter 13. If you'd like to try and put a title on the chapter, it would be all about submission, about submitting to one another. And Paul sort of makes the point, as he had sort of previously in the theory lesson, he's now sort of really hammering home the point that the Jews were really bad subjects. They were, for foreign nations trying to rule over them, they're really tough people to get along with, and that is particularly based on because they place so much emphasis on the quote from Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 15, which says, you shall have no foreigners to rule over you. They had a really strong objection to anyone that was in rulership over them. They hated anyone ruling over them, and that was so Paul's point is they're bad subjects, and he says, but the ruling powers actually have claims that need to be met because, as Paul says, God sets them up. So if they are ruling over you, you need to obey them, is what he's saying in verses 1 to 3. And so there's nothing wrong with having ruling powers in place. In fact, it's by God's design. And he goes on to add to that point, particularly in verses 6 to 7, about the fact that it is not our place to right social wrongs. It's much as that might appeal to us, to go around trying to fix up all of the problems of the world. That's not our place, as Paul says. And and we can talk about this if we like, but if you think about it in the terms of things that are going on at the present time, with all the they've got protests about lockdowns, we've got protests about compulsory vaccinations, we've got protests about people's rights and entitlements. There's lots of protesting going on, and Paul's argument is that's not our place. We're not in this world to be going around fixing up all the things that are wrong with society. God knows they're wrong. What we need to do is to work using the opportunities that we have with each other, rather than going around trying to be agitators from a political point of view. But, he says, we do have some obligations. We've got a really important obligation and an ongoing obligation, he says in verse 8, and that is to love. That is our enduring obligation. And we do this, like we look after ourselves. We might sort of feed ourselves and take ourselves to the doctor if we're not feeling well and so on. We look after ourselves in spite of our various faults and problems. And so Paul's saying, so therefore, there's no excuse for us not looking after others in spite of their faults, because they too have their problems and faults. And if you can understand how to look after yourself, then he's saying we should be able to work out how to look after others as well. And he's saying, if you like, in verse 11, he's saying, well, look, we need to live now as if Jesus is here. That's the point. If we've got the right mentality, we'll be living now as if the kingdom has already arrived. And so he says, do things that are only the sorts of things that are fit to be exposed. And back to the point, if you remember from the theory discussion about the secrets of our hearts are going to be judged, he's saying only do those things which are fit to be exposed to the light. In other words, we need to put on Christ so that he can be seen in us. Remember that's what God's looking for. He's looking into each of us and saying, can I see a bit of Jesus in you? And if so, then you have the potential for immortal life and being part of my long-term plan and purpose. And that's how the sort of chapter rounds out in verse 14. So this chapter, as I say, has been a lot about submitting or submission to one another. And you might be thinking, well, that can be pretty hard at times. To submit and to perhaps yield to another's point of view, or where they might be thinking that things' importance must be placed. So now comes our challenge. Let's put this into practice. So have a think about this. How have other Christadelphians hurt your experience? And have you let it go? And I'll give you a prod here, just by way of a prompt to try and set the scene and have a think about some of the experiences that perhaps you may have also had. So I can remember a time I was fairly young in my Christadelphian sort of baptised life, and Ron and Mark are on this call, and so they'll remember some of the time when this occurred. And in the Ecclesia that I was in at the time, there was basically the Ecclesia was about to divide, and it was dividing over of all things, it was dividing over the type of bread that should be used in the memorial, and which was in this particular case, the Ecclesia was using leavened bread, and the person wanted to use unleavened bread, which was the type that we typically use at the Moorebank meeting, and so there was a major division about to occur, and I was completely distressed about the whole thing, and I took upon myself to talk to a brother that was had a particularly strong view in this regard, and I thought we had reached an agreement about how we could resolve this. And so I thought, this is wonderful. We've reached a resolution that will solve the problem and allow reconciliation. And when it actually got to the point of the ecclesial meeting, the person that I had been talking to changed their point of view, and so it ended up in the Ecclesia dividing. And I was very hurt by that, because I thought I had reached an agreement. I tried to speak to the person one-on-one, as would be the guide of Scripture, and all to no avail. Now, lest this be thought of as being an opportunity to vent and to say how awful other Christadelphians are, remember this has a tail end to this, and that is, have you let it go? Have you forgiven the person and let it go? Because it's really, this is about us. It's not about the other person. And so I'd be interested to know whether others have got experiences that they'd like to share.
I got an experience I could share with you.
Okay.
Back in early on when I came into the truth, the first prayer I ever said in the meeting, there was a brother who he sort of revved me a little bit about my prayer. I think it was probably because I was still in a little bit of a Protestant mode in the way of praying. And that really sort of hurt me. It really knocked me for a six. And it took quite a long time to let it go. But I finally did let it go, and I'm over it now and all the rest of it. But it took a long time.
Yep. No, look, thank you for sharing, because that's the sort of thing that can be very demoralising to people's experience. Is getting some criticism when we're trying to do our best, and and I guess well done for being able to move on from it, because that's of course where we need to get to, and and a lot of well-meaning and intent ends up going astray when people end up trying to add value when they're actually making it a lot harder and a very demoralising experience. So thanks for sharing. All right.
Sorry, Dan, I was going to say it's probably a bit hard. Like that with that question is sort of, maybe there's things that we've probably buried and and don't want to bring them up, really. That's probably something, maybe why there was a bit of quiet there.
No, well, that's a good point, David, and that's and well done, everyone. If that's you, if you've got old hurts that are well and truly disappeared because you've sorted them out and they've been buried, then that's excellent. We should all be able to effectively not even have to think about it. All right, but that's what this is all about. This is real, and it's and the apostle is actually digging into some of the things that we have truly experienced. All right, so let's press on now to chapter 14, and this is where it really starts to get into the bits and pieces of interacting with each other. So chapter 14. And I've given this chapter the title "The Weak and the Strong," and there's lots in this, so we'll go reasonably slowly through this and try and add some value as we go through. So, regarding the law of love, so Paul's given us a whole bit of an understanding about this law of love, or this obligation to love that we have to one another. And he says that the complete opposite of that is what he would, I guess, describe as the superstitious observance of irrelevant things. And we all have them. So don't think this isn't about you. We all have things which to us feel really important. We all have a line where we draw a line and say, that's not, I don't like it being that way, or I don't want to worship that way, or I don't like it happening in that way. all of us have a line, no matter how liberal we might think we are. And so Paul's saying, we can all get stuck into this stuff, unfortunately. And so he's saying that a person with scruples, and that's a bit of an unusual word there, scruples, but if you look at it in the dictionary, it's really just putting an over importance on small details is effectively what that word's about. And it's saying a person with scruples, we need to receive them. So if they're making a big deal about a little thing, we need to accept that and not argue about it. Because if you try and argue a person out of their small little point, all it does is reinforce the point and do the reverse of what you're trying to do. And so he's saying, if you get all hot and bothered about it, all it does is cause strife and contention. And then it gets all blurry, because we're then sort of starting to have an argument about something that's really unimportant. And so, he's saying, focus on the things that are really important and essential. And so it's interesting that in this regard, and some of you may have experienced this, when you get to that point and you do just let it go, interestingly, as time goes on, it does reduce the importance, and you can sort of see it for what it was, and so it wasn't actually that important after all. But, and I will say this is important, and this is about things that are about things that are unimportant. It's not about, this isn't about essential doctrine or someone that's doing something which is clearly against the principles that are laid out in the Bible. But this is about things that may be an interpretation or a way of doing things that are not essential for fellowship. And so they shouldn't be any basis for us to exclude anyone. And this, of course, as the second point on the screen there says, this does cut both ways though, because, we have a dual responsibility to not scorn the person who has an issue, that is, they're making a big deal about something small, and it's also not scorning the person that doesn't have an issue, that is being, from the other point of view, saying, well, why isn't it a problem for you? I mean, it really is a problem for me, and that does cut both ways, as Paul's arguing. He's saying, we need to be able to see that sometimes these things can be seen from two different points of view. And there is actually no class distinction in the Ecclesia, which is also interesting because, if you think about, all of us that are in this discussion now, I mean, we've all come from very different backgrounds. We've all from, very different walks of life, different careers, even different sort of locations. And yet we're all one in Christ, is the argument that Paul's giving. And so there's no one that's more important than anyone else. And it's not for us to judge another person's motives, why they might be thinking that an issue is important or not important. It's not for us to judge that. That's for God. And so we can inadvertently be making an action into a sin which is not. And so Paul is saying to us, we need to avoid this by being kindly and tolerant. And I sort of prod you with a few examples here of ones that I have seen over the years. Some people have a particularly strong point of view about the dress code for the meeting, or they might have a particular issue about the consumption of alcohol, and those sorts of issues can become very important to some people and very unimportant to other people. So there's sort of a few of the examples that you might be able to recall, and there's almost a classic example that I guess I'll depersonalize it and make it a non-Christadelphian thing. There's some particular parts of Christianity make a particular point about Sabbath Day observance. So the Seventh Day Adventists, for example, they feel it's incredibly important to have their worship on the Saturday instead of the Sunday, based on the Sabbath principle from the Old Testament. And as we know, the majority don't feel that is a thing that needs to be observed, but it's an example of one of those things that are picked up from the Bible and made into a really important point, particularly for them. So what we need to do is to acknowledge that whatever we do is having an effect on others. And so we need to work together. And the best preservative against pleasing ourselves is being and showing the character of Jesus to each other. And that's, I guess you're probably sort of pondering this and sort of working out, well, how does that apply? Because it can, in some cases, seem like we're being told to do told what to do by someone that has a particular point about something small. And it's not about, it's almost, I'll flip that around and say, well, it's not about thinking that we're being told what to do, but rather we choose what to do for their sake. So, and even if they're, we might think they're completely misguided about their minor point, then we still need to accommodate them, because you don't want them to stumble, as back to Paul's point about the Jews and stumbling over the stumbling stone. We don't want them to fall over, and so we try and help them with their situation, because God is working in them too. And he's saying that the weakest person, the least worthy person, is worth more than you proving your point. And because for those people, that particular thing, if it's really important to them, then for them it is sin if they do the wrong thing, or what they believe to be is the wrong thing. And however, and there's a bit of sting in the tail here for those people that have a particularly strong view, though. They do need to declare their position if they believe a thing to be really wrong. Otherwise, they're effectively just, compromising and sinning and not allowing us to help them with their particular issue. And as we know, there are many things of order and arrangement, as we would put it in our constitution, things that we would say are, unessential. They're not things that are in the Bible, but they are designed so that we don't offend each other, so that things don't become an issue. And hopefully the whole point of it, if we've got it right or close to right, we won't even notice things happening, because they'll just be the way that we do things, and not causing anyone to get irritated or uncomfortable. So, and I'm sort of up to verse 18 now in this chapter. Paul's saying the things that we do are not so much important as our motive. It's the actions that we take, while they might seem important to us at the time, are really, what Paul's saying is not so important as the way that we do them and the reason we do them, the motive that we have behind them. And so he's saying, follow things which make for peace and that build each other up, in verse 19, because it's easy to break, it's easy to smash things to pieces, but it takes care to build something up. And if you are strong, he's saying, then be glad of the freedom that you have. Be glad that you don't have a particular issue with small problems, but he's saying don't throw it around. You know, if you've got strength, don't wield it like a weapon. And some people might sort of say they've found this new enlightenment. They say, oh, this wasn't a problem after all. It's just a non-issue. And then they go about trying to force others to have the same point of view. And that is also damaging. It's not for us to go forcing people to yield to our particular newfound wisdom or enlightenment. And Paul's saying in verse 22, it may be actually much more useful to yield on these minor points. And some by contrast, they might allow things, all sorts of things, thinking that it's showing a sign of their strength. But in actual fact, what they're doing is justifying the things that they want. They're saying, well, I like doing these things, and so therefore for me it's not a problem. But they are then feeling justified, but not by Christ. That's not how justification works. And as might be sort of well put by someone, a seared conscience, that is one that's been burnt through, is not the same as a clear conscience. In other words, you can make out that things aren't a problem just because it suits you. But in actual fact, if that's not what the Bible requires, then we're actually causing not only a problem for ourselves, but potentially a problem for others. And so Paul's argument towards the bottom of the page there on your screens, he's saying they both have the potential to be condemned. The weak can be condemned if they have a scruple, an issue about a small problem, and they say, well, for them it is sin, and they don't live up to it. And similarly, the strong can also have a problem if they cause others to sin or try and force others to yield to their point of view. And so Paul's saying the happy position, and we should be in a happy position if we are free from doubt. That is, we're not just making up the rules to suit ourselves, and that we are found doing the right thing. And the unhappy person is the person that's yielding to their selfish desires or following someone else's bad example. And so he rounds out the chapter by saying, if you're trying to move into grey areas, if you're trying to blur the edges, then it is an indication of a problem, and a problem with motives in particular. And it's normally our human nature that takes us into these areas of compromise. And either we do that to suit our human nature, or and this is the other challenge, and this is how the Jews tended to do it. They ended up making all of these extra rules and making things over important. And it might sound like we're potentially a bunch of weirdos, but we're in this together to try and help each other with our various issues. And we're doing this because God said so. God wanted us to come together as a group and to help each other. And so we need to try and make it work. So let's challenge ourselves. And this is, maybe an opportunity to interact. What grey areas are creating differences in our ecclesias? I'm wondering if you can think of any that are potential issues for us.
It's an interesting one, because harking back to what David said, that sometimes you just feel a little bit uncomfortable sharing that, other than to say, if I could speak more broadly, perhaps in that safe zone that you were in before, Dan, it could be things like blood transfusion. In my mother's day, indeed, it was contraception. It could be, if you were living in America right now in the Bible Belt, it could be vaccination. So yeah, there's a number of ones that come up. I guess it was a bit of a non-issue in New Zealand because you didn't have to vote, but for some Christadelphians today, it's voting. So it's a couple of starters from Lindsay.
Good ones. Yeah, there's lots in there that have touched on issues that have been challenges. We could even sort of throw in there the more recent debates about same-sex marriage and those sorts of things that are challenges to us all.
I mean, the usual things that come up in ecclesias where there's differences of opinion would relate to music, would relate to dress, would relate to which Bible version, would relate to bread, leavened, unleavened bread. They're the usual things that can come up and probably fall into that category. Maybe some of the other ones that we just mentioned maybe fall into bit deeper issues. Yeah.
No, good point, David. And I guess I would also sort of prompt that the ones where relationships get involved, they're the ones that tend to be the most bitter. Where sort of people are either very offended or it's actually sort of dealing with interpersonal relationships, as where things can get really, really difficult. Any other thoughts from the team?
I have maybe a comment as well, that some areas might be grey for some people and not grey for others. So we have to be aware of that as well.
Yeah, no, good point, Johnny, and quite right. And it's the path of wisdom is sometimes being able to say, well, I won't share this particular point because I know that it's going to be upsetting to someone.
I think, doesn't it come back to, the main point was submission, to try and bring peace in the ecclesia. And that might be a bit of give and take on both sides of an equation. So something that might not be important to you, but is important to someone else, well, maybe I've got to give a bit to help that person. I just don't want it to be a feud between me and another person. And so if I know that's an issue, well, I might do what Johnny said, maybe not to bring it up, or not to force the issue.
Good point. So I've got one more question to put in this relation, and might stretch us in a little bit of a different direction, and that is that how have you done something which has helped achieve peace and building up? And that's and it can be a little bit like Johnny's just said, about just maybe not sharing a point because it would be unhelpful, but sometimes this can go beyond just pulling our horns in or whatever. Sometimes it's sort of going a bit beyond and saying, well, how can we do something which achieves peace and builds up? Because that's where Paul's challenging us. He's saying, think about ways in which you can build others up rather than pull them apart.
This sort of relates to Michael Langtree's share about when people are new at things. I think it's really important to find one good thing that they didn't tell them, especially when they're a little bit nervous about doing something, especially when it's public, but not just when it's public. But I think it really helps to have verbal affirmation from someone. And we have so many ways we can do this. It doesn't have to be, even when we are face to face, you don't have to go up to them afterwards and say, oh, that was a great prayer, or thank you for reading that. I really enjoyed the way you read that. We can just text someone. It doesn't have to be face to face, and sometimes that can be scary for people. But I think especially when people are new at things, or if you know that they're nervous about doing a thing, just congratulating them on having the bravery to do it, because we are a volunteer community. No one's getting paid. Everyone wants to try and do their best, and we should help each other to feel like coming back to the table and giving it another go.
Oh, good share. Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, that you might think, oh, well, how possibly can we bring this to a wrap, given we've still got another chapter to get through? But it actually is a fairly much a summary chapter, chapter 15, in terms of pulling it all together. So Paul's given us the whole argument. He's given us the theory, and now we've talked about how to put it all into practice. And so he says in chapter 15, the way of love helps the weak with the burdens that they make for themselves. In other words, we all have our various problems and our issues and our quirks and our different ways of doing things. And Paul's encouraging us to find the way of love that helps those, all of us, each with our various problems and the burdens we make for ourselves trying to get to the kingdom. And that we each need to give account for our own responsibilities, which have been uniquely provided to us. And as we talked about last week, we each have been given this custom designed plan to help us get to salvation. We've each been invited to be part of it, and provided we do accept it, God does work with us and give us our own particular plan to work towards salvation. And that may be very different to that which is given to another, but our responsibility is to work with that and give account for that when we do eventually stand before judgment. And that's Paul's letter to the Romans. So hopefully that's been useful to all. And so we have now been through both the theory and the practice and tied it all together. And I'll stop sharing now and give you a chance to do a bit of your own sharing.